Good afternoon, everyone. This is Shauna LaRue Marai from the ICF team, and we're so pleased that you have chosen to listen to the conversation that I will be having shortly with HUD's Office of Community Planning and Development Programs. This is a spotlight session. It's meant to be a conversation between myself and our panel here. So glad that you're with us. Just a couple of reminders as we get started here that if you have any technical issues with the Zoom application, our team is ready to support you. If there is time at the end, we will see what kind of questions have come into the questions box and see if we can handle a couple of those. And as I mentioned, I work at ICF, and I'm going to welcome Joey or Joseph Bietti. He is the Special Assistant to the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary in HUD's Office of Community Planning and Development. And Joey, welcome to the Spotlight session.
Thank you. Yeah, excited to be here. Thanks everyone for joining.
Yes, and we have a number of people in the audience. So I'm very excited for us to get started. So a couple things. So we partnered together in May for the Serving Communities Through Housing Counseling Conference, which was, I would say really successful. We had over 1,200 people in attendance, had a lot of really great conversations. So I just want to make sure that I recognize that partnership that we had just a few months ago. And so what we want to do today is, like, with that kind of in mind, the backdrop, there was a lot of great conversations there about the community planning and development programs, lots of contacts, lots of like synergy there about how housing counseling can work really well with community planning and development programs. So just want to kind of start us off with, why don't you tell us kind of what's been going on since May related to some of the CARES Act funding, such as the Community Development Block Grant Program, CDBG CV. Why don't we start there?
Yeah, definitely. And I know that we are always excited to make connections between our grantees and any other organizations who can assist them in designing and implementing their programs. So to give you a little bit of an overview of our CV funding or our CARES Act funding, so I'll start with CDBG CV. So as you know, that's the coronavirus, the CARES Act funding of the CDBG program. So HUD has obligated all $5 billion of the CDBG CV, and of that, $1.8 billion has been dispersed by our grantees. So as you may be aware, CDBG CV grants have a 6-year period of performance, and the first expenditure threshold is actually coming up in May 2023. So it's getting really important for our grantees to start thinking about spending down those funds. CDBG CV has already helped a lot of people, and by a lot, I mean 10 million people. The funding has mostly been used for public services, but about 24,000 jobs have been created or retained with CDBG CV funds so far. But as we're all aware, the pandemic is not over, and there's still a lot of work that can be done to help prevent, respond to, and recover from COVID-19. So we really want to encourage our grantees and all of our grantees partners to think about ways that they can utilize this funding to best assist their communities. So approximately half of our grantees have dispersed less than half of their CDBG CV funds, and only about 0.1% or about $89,000 has actually been used for housing counseling services. So we really see that there's the potential opportunity for housing counselors to take advantage of some of the funding that's still out there. So we definitely encourage all of those who are participating today to really work on making connections with the CDBG CV grantee to see how potentially your programs can assist our grantees. There are a ton of resources on CDBG CV that are on the HUD Exchange website. And I know that we had talked a little bit before about the CDBG CV toolkit that actually highlights housing counseling as an eligible activity. So definitely encourage everyone to take a look at the CDBG CV toolkit to see how housing counseling can be a part of CV programs.
Okay, fantastic, Joey. And I did pop in the toolkit link
Okay.
just for our audience to take a look at that. And there is just so much opportunity. And you, as housing counseling agencies, have your program ready to go. And so offering your services would be really helpful.
Yeah, and I also think that making the connection to housing, how housing counseling can support programs that are already out there. So our grantees are already engaged in lots of programs, many housing activities. And so really looking at what types of activities our grantees are already doing with the funding and how housing counseling can actually be integrated into those activities, I think is a really good start.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense as well. And we know that housing counseling agencies have been working with their clients on rental assistance and also prevention of foreclosure. And some of those funds we know have been largely used in the CDBG-CV program. So your suggestion to see how housing counseling could be added to the mix in terms of a service when they're already working in some of these programs, I think is a great idea, Joey.
Mhm.
So,
So,
oh
oh,
yeah, sorry. So
mhm.
I think we should move on to the other CARES Act program, the Emergency Solutions Grant, ESG-CV. And why don't you tell us what's going on with that program for those that are working with those that are homeless and formerly homeless?
Yeah, definitely. So for just a quick update on ESG CV and where we stand now. So HUD has obligated all 4 billion of ESG CV funds and recipients have dispersed about 2.4 billion. So around 624,000 people have been served through emergency solutions grants, through emergency shelters. About 91,000 have been served through rapid rehousing. 109,000 served through street outreach programs, and 102,000 served with homelessness prevention services. So this funding has already helped a lot of people, but as you can see, there's a little less than half still available. So definitely that same idea of reaching out to those who are managing the ESG CV funding and really figuring out how housing counseling services can be added. Um, Another point that the Office of Special Needs Assistance Programs wanted me to bring up today is that HUD actually recaptured $52.2 million in CDBG CV funding. So that consists of 16.4 million recaptured associated with the September 30th, 2021 20% expenditure deadline. I'm not sure if you all are aware of that. But then there was about 35.8 million that was recaptured, which was associated with the June 16th 50% draw deadline. So HUD is actually working on reallocating that $52.2 million, which will be awarded by formula. So another point there is to keep an eye on that and see which grantees are actually receiving additional ESG CV funding and making sure that you are involved in how those grantees are going to use that funding.
Okay, that's a great point. And also, we are all about making connections, Joey. So you can, if you're new to the homeless programs in terms of this audience and don't know who to go to, I'm also going to make sure that you have the link to finding out like which grantees are in your area. And then also we have created a large repository of resources around rental housing counseling that includes homeless prevention as well. And so there's a lot of really great resources, not on the CPD side like the other toolkit is, but this one is on the housing counseling side. So if you haven't utilized any of these resources or check them out, we highly recommend that. And there's actually a board on rental assistance right now. I think there is another community board in Hoover on homeless prevention. So maybe some of you that are here are going to be looking at those boards if you haven't. So just lots of really helpful information there, and certainly find your ESG contact locally and see what you can do.
Yeah, and I will also make the note that all of the reallocated funds, so that 52.2 million, they have to be expended by June 30th, 2024. So just putting that out there because all of these CV funds actually have to be expended relatively quickly. So these timelines are coming up within a year or two. So just to keep that in mind as you're starting to reach out to these contacts and really offering how you can support the spend down of these funds for vital programs, I think is going to be really helpful to our grantees.
Okay, great. And as we were talking, it does look like somebody wrote in about housing authorities and working with the continuum of care. Thanks for that reminder. We have housing counseling agencies that do wear other hats in their jurisdictions. You might be the housing authority. So we always would recommend that you make sure that you have a seat at the table for the continuum of care planning committees that go on locally, to make sure that they understand, you know, the clients that you're serving, the needs that you're aware of that your clients have, and then also see how you can support them in terms of their mission. Again, certified housing counselors have the credentials that can really assist in many different places in terms of where somebody is with their housing goals. So thanks for that question. So maybe we should move on to the home ARP program. And I know I have a few things, few words of advice, since I work with both housing counseling as well as the CPD programs like home ARP. But home ARP comes from the American Rescue Plan, as you know, Joey, and we got a great sense in May about the status of where folks were with their allocation plans at that time. But we're really looking today is like, give us an update in terms of the allocation plans, like, you know, what percentage have been approved, kind of where folks are. And then I'll talk about some opportunities for the housing counseling agencies here with us today.
Yeah, great. So HUD, as of Friday last week is when I get the most updates. We have received 133 allocation plans, and 57 of those plans have been accepted. As of right now, the majority of home ARP funding is being proposed for use toward rental activities. So about 60% of all the funding detailed in allocation plans is going to rental activities. And then a point to note is that the home ARP grant is about 3.6 times the size of the regular FY21 home grant. So this is providing a one-time opportunity to create housing and shelter assets to serve communities over time. It's really important to think about just the sheer size of these grants are a lot larger than our typical home grantees are used to. So home ARP encourages new community partnerships and consideration of equity in community consultation, program planning, and program implementation. So I think it is a real opportunity is if there are housing counselors out there who have not been involved with the home program before, home ARP is a different program and is really set on encouraging new partnerships. And so it's a very good opportunity to kind of make those connections now. Even though the grantee is the same, the program is quite different in a lot of ways. And so really encourage all housing counselors to get to know how they can maybe support home ARP activities.
Yeah, I think all that's really important. And what I like to tell folks when I'm training on home ARP is that it's really the home program, you know, got together with the homeless programs with a couple of add-ons in terms of various populations that can be served, Joey. But it is true in terms of like, this is like a new opportunity for our communities to get additional like capital projects, like construction projects, rehabilitative projects, and then also non-congregate shelter, which is very expensive to build, is also a new opportunity underneath the home ARP or home ARP program that a lot of communities are focused on. It doesn't mean there aren't services like housing counseling that can go along with those. And housing counseling is a standalone eligible service. And some communities are exploring all of those options right now in terms of how all that could work together. So just want to kind of explain a little bit more about what's eligible. And also there's still, as you said, a real opportunity in terms of getting to the table about consultations that are going on, making sure that housing counseling agencies are listed as a group, that the home ARP PJ, they're called participating jurisdictions, they have the ability to work with them on consultation to talk about their client needs, talk about what kinds of services, what kind of housing. I mean, we just got off of a session David talking about the supply of affordable housing. We know that's always on all of our minds as affordable housing advocates. So the Home Art program is sort of like a one-shot, lots that folks can do with the program. And we're just now in the planning stage. We're in that kind of very early on implementation stage.
Yeah, exactly. And I know you mentioned that you work both with the housing programs and the CPD programs. So do you have other tips on how housing counselors may be able to engage in the consultation process for home ARP?
I do. So a number of states right now, and also, the cities, counties, et cetera, those that receive the home art funds as well. And right now, as they put together plans, they have that consultation process that I mentioned earlier, where they need to have consultation with a number of different stakeholder groups. And it's not just, the home program, they may not always be meeting with the continuum of care or the continuum of care variety of agencies. So if your organization happens to work in that space that you're serving the homeless or the formerly homeless, there's also qualifying populations that are different this time, such as those that have been human trafficked. And so you may have some expertise in terms of those with lived experience that could also inform the process. So get yourself at the table, get your clients at the table. Comment when you see their draft plan in terms of their allocation plan. Make sure that it makes sense to you for your community. I think all of those things would be important in terms of the role that you play in your jurisdiction. And then I can say this, HUD can't say this, but I have been working in the home program since its inception, pretty much in 1992. I guess I was 5 years off. 97 is when I started, but it is one of the most successful HUD programs, and funding has just changed over time. And so I think that right now, understanding what is eligible in terms of the home program itself, we know that home buyer is eligible, and there's housing counseling that's tied to that. But with home ARP or home ARP, we're really talking about those that need rental housing and those that need like rental housing counseling like services. And so it's just a great time to get involved locally if that is not a program you're an expert in, because we can really change America's communities with some of these funding sources. And I would say that for CDBG-CV and ESG-CV, just they're for a different purpose. They're shorter term, not as longer term as the home art program. I hope that's helpful, Joey.
Yeah, I think so. I think anytime, that's kind of my best advice to anyone looking to get involved in CPD funding, particularly CDBG and home, and that's true of CV and ARP as well, is to really know your grantee and understand what the grantee is trying to do with the funding, and then make sure that you're advocating for the population you serve. Because all of the planning documents have to be online, they have to be accessible to the public. And so being the one who's going to take on responsibility for reading those plans, digesting those plans, and figuring out how you can advocate for the population you serve is how best you can get involved in those programs.
Yes, absolutely. And a couple folks wrote in and had some questions around grant opportunities. We're recommending that you use the grantee list that I put the link in the chat to reach out to those home ARP grantees so that you find out like who you can work with. Again, they're called participating jurisdictions, in case you see that term.
Yeah,
well, Joey, oh yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Well, I'll just make a point on that. So all of the participating jurisdictions, all 651 of them who received funding in FY21 for home, were eligible to receive home ARP. So if you have worked with a home participating jurisdiction in the past, it's likely the same participating jurisdiction or the same grantee for the home ARP grant. So I would say make that connection. The list you sent is going to be the best way to reach out, because these grants are formula grants, so they're not competitive. And so the grantee receives the funding every year. These are special programs, but the grantee receives the funding every year on a kind of a non-competitive basis. And so if you're looking to get involved, the best way to do that is to reach out to the grantee and kind of understand what gaps they may have, or understand what programs or activities they're already doing and how you can assist those.
Yes, exactly. Thank you for that. And that link is always updated whenever there's new allocations and things like that. But thanks for mentioning that it's not competitive. It may be competitive at the local level, but not the awards that come out to these cities, counties, and states. So I know that there are two pretty large projects in terms of CPD that you wanted to touch on. Because we mentioned the supply of affordable housing, I really thought that maybe you could touch on the work that's going on in CPD around the, available housing stock, what's going on locally, the White House initiative in terms of adding to housing stock. And it was definitely asked on HUVA as we started the conference this week. So tell us what's going on in terms of the supply, Joey.
Yeah, so the department is really supporting the administration's effort to encourage more affordable housing development. And one way we're doing that is through the Our Way Home initiative, which is really centered on localized efforts to address housing shortage, while also encouraging partners to use federal resources to build quality, affordable housing, as well as bringing up and lifting up the importance of preserving existing affordable housing. So it's about creating housing and increasing housing supply, but not forgetting that one way to do that is really preserving what existing affordable housing is already out there. So the initiative, the Our Way Home initiative that HUD is championing, is an initiative that creates a platform for cities to learn from each other. So it's really creating that peer-to-peer learning network. And we're really trying to highlight effective ways to increase housing supply. CPD is involved in various ways through our programs. We're trying to increase our resources to help grantees understand how they can support housing development with CPD funding. And one way that we're doing that is through the creation of an affordable housing supply toolkit. So we're currently working on that toolkit now. It will be published sometime in the fall. And that's really speaking directly to our grantees and trying to provide them information on how they can use funds to support housing activities. So I'm not sure if those on the call know, but CDBG is not a housing program. It's a community economic development program, but it can be used to support housing development outside of housing construction. And so kind of thinking about different ways, maybe more innovative ways that you can use some of your funding to support housing activities. We're also building up our library of resources that address housing constraint policies like restrictive zoning. So that'll be covered in the housing supply toolkit as well. And we are going to continue improving our resources to address some of these issues at the local level.
Well, I know, again, we're all advocates for affordable housing and to add to our supply, which we know is so needed. We are behind in terms of the supply in this country, and it's talked about on every single call I think that I'm a part of with advocacy groups. So I really can't wait for the report and also the toolkit that you mentioned so that we can try again to continue to work together on increasing the supply. I wonder if you could touch on sort of our final prepared questions here, Joey, in terms of the climate resilience work that's been going on in CPD, and then we'll answer a few questions in the questions box.
Great, yeah. So we really believe that you can't have quality, affordable homes that are vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. And so we really want to make sure that all of our housing is resilient to whatever impact is most vulnerable to. So is that flooding? Is it extreme heat? We can't have communities who are equitable and accessible if we have huge populations that are more in danger from flooding or extreme heat than others. So we think that it's really important for our grantees to understand how they can increase their resilience. And one call to action, so to speak, for those on this call would be to make sure that the clients that they serve, whether it's tenants or home buyers, make sure that they understand what climate vulnerability is. What are they most vulnerable to before they can make an informed decision on where they should reside in terms of their housing? They need to know how they're going to be impacted by climate stressors. So we really encourage everyone here to include climate vulnerability in the topics covered in their counseling sessions or their group education classes. And we really want to make sure that the client has an idea of whatever property they are considering for their home, that they understand if they choose that property, they will be more or less likely to, say, flood, or they'll have to get air conditioning because there's going to be a certain number of high heat days that they're going to be vulnerable to. We also think that it's important that anyone purchasing a house understands what their obligations are under the National Flood Insurance Program and how much they will have to be paying for flood insurance. So really encourage all of our housing counselors to get, if they're not already, to get really versed in the areas of vulnerabilities in terms of climate and what strategies exist to cope with those vulnerabilities. So what strategies can a person choose in terms of where they can locate to be less susceptible to climate hazards, or if they are going to choose a specific housing choice that is more vulnerable to climate change, what are some strategies that they can use to help make sure that they stay safe in that area?
Okay, thanks for that. And while you were talking, I popped in the disaster housing counseling toolkit that the ICF team worked hand in hand with our colleagues and HUD's colleagues in CPD to make sure we were putting out information about how to conduct housing counseling amid a disaster, and also some of the steps that you mentioned in terms of preparing their clients. Although we need to take that a step further, Joey, there still needs to be some additional resources there. So I'm excited to hear about the work that you're doing in CPD around climate resilience, to see what else we need to add. Maybe it's a checklist or something like that that counselors can use. And I'm thinking about counselors sit in a position where they're talking about where will they reside, like you said, or maybe where they do reside, that maybe that their house needs to be elevated, or maybe they need a buyout to be bought out of their house and move somewhere else because where they're staying is not going to be sustainable over time. And these are questions we have to ask ourselves if we're homeowners too, in terms of what our risks are. So some type of checklist might be really helpful in the future. So really excited about that work. We did have one question or a couple of questions I could touch on before we close out. So Rena was asking about like additional funding for startup housing counseling agencies. I feel like the answer, Rena, is like twofold. I went ahead and answered you in terms of there is funding available through community planning and development for housing counseling. And I provided the link, which I also will put out to everyone in the chat box, that we created a resources list during that May conference. So I will touch on that. So while there is funding there, you also, and I feel like this has also come up already today on another session, where folks I know are looking at coverage of rural areas and high need areas where they aren't the housing counseling agency today, maybe because they're not HUD approved, because you might need resources. There are a number of different state housing finance agencies that participate in HUD's program. There are national intermediaries. I mean, there's so many different partners that if you're just getting started in terms of housing counseling and want to figure out how best to ramp up, creating a relationship with one of the HUD intermediaries, and I'll provide a link there as well through the chat box. Just take a look, see if your state HFA is currently participating. If they're not, look around to see who else might be covering your area. That's really our best advice. They can really be helpful. You can also apply on your own. You can pull together your funding. But depending upon who you're trying to serve, you might be able to get further technical assistance from one of these national partners. Is an idea for you. Absolutely. You're welcome. Okay, well, I want to see if there's anything else in the Q&A box. Joey, you're welcome to take a look too if there's anything else that we should touch on. I think think we answered most of them. And thanks, Allie, for being helpful behind the scenes. So, okay, so I think that we are at the end of the presentation, Joey. So I'm going to go ahead and share the screen again, that you and I put together these resources that are here in terms of a few things that we thought that folks wanted to know about, from the recovery housing program to various waivers that are available, also what's going on in the homeless programs around COVID, and then finally with the home allocation plans and getting links to those.
Yeah, and I would mention it's really important to make sure that you are aware of when our grantees are going through their planning process, because all of their activities that they want to do with their CPD funding have to actually be outlined in their consolidated plans and their annual action plans. And so if you see that housing counseling isn't already a part of those plans, it's not that it can't be, they just have to go through an amendment to the plan, which is it's a process that most grantees go through regularly, so it's familiar to them. But just so you know, it's better to get in earlier at the beginning when they're going through that planning process, so that you can include housing counseling in those activities if there's a need there. So definitely encourage you all to reach out to the CDBG, the ESG, and the home grantees. Get familiar so that you can make sure you have a seat at the table during the planning process, and then it's just going to be easier for everyone going forward. So that's just a little tip.
Yeah, thanks, Joey. And we are going to continue the conversation and make these linkages on HUVA. So please keep up the conversation there. We will be checking throughout the rest of the next couple of days and into next week. And if you want to stay connected here, here's the link to the conference, and also how to contact HUD directly if you would like to touch base with them about anything that you heard today. We do have a couple sessions coming up at 2 o'clock, culturally sensitive and linguistically appropriate housing counseling. We're also going to have a session on minority serving institutions and also the disaster recovery process. You have a choice there. But thank you so much for attending, and thank you, Joey, for talking to me today about what's been going on in community planning and development.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you everyone for attending.